my job today is to introduce Professor Paul Gough. It's a real honour and a pleasure to have him here. He's a dear colleague and friend of mine and also of the gallery. He's a huge support to us. And I think Paul is nothing short of a living evocation of the Duracell bunny. I mean, his energy knows no bounds. Not only is he principal and vice chair of the Arts University in Bournemouth, but he is a prolific lecturer and author with a big emphasis on war art, on which he did his PhD. He's an artist. Check out his Instagram. Some really beautiful, beautiful pictures he has done on that. He is running a project on Paul Nash in Dorset, which again, you can see on Instagram, which is another great enterprise, which I hope you will get to publish one of these days. And he's also running a project with Amy Lim, one of our volunteers and curators here, getting together all Gilbert's works, creating an online monograph. So all in all, you are a busy man. So thank you for coming to see us. Oh, and I forgot, if you are sort of into your TikTok, Paul is actually Banksy, but when I told my children I was going to see Paul Gough, they said, "What, Banksy?" Anyway, Paul, thank you so much for coming to see us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, and for inviting me along to this evening. Some thanks to start with. There have been thanks already, but thanks to all the organisers, Chris and colleagues, and Amanda in particular, for inviting me here, making me feel very welcome, and getting the organisation. I know what the logistics are like. Running a university, most of my job is logistics. I thought the exhibition, the remarkable exhibition, the Robert Wagner show at the moment, I mean, so impressive. Such a brilliant idea, bringing contemporary artists into the gallery. So well done for doing that. I bought some copies of the Holy Box book that we did, and Amanda has done a part of this as well. This is, I'll show 10 slides about this, not just a plug, but because it's the untold story about Stanley and the Berkeley Chapel. It's a great story. A really lovely book to have done, that one. I also bought for free some rather old, but a catalogue of landscape paintings of mine, which I thought just to share with you. And of course, the remarkable Cookham Festival. I mean, there are colleagues in the room here who have been able to put this together. And I was contacted on a few weeks ago by, who's in the room who's organised, who put the organisation of this? Yeah, at the back there. What a job you've done. So I was phoned up and said, can you be free on Star Wars Day, May the 4th? And I said, yes, I can. What time do you want me? He said 2:15 or 12:15. I said, who's on before? And they said, Will Gompertz. And I thought, well, there you go, there's a start. Will Gompertz, and you've got the theatre critic at the Times. I thought they're, showstopper. Then there's me, and then after me is Ross Kemp. I thought, I will be the warm-up act for Ross Kemp. So do come May the 4th. I'll be talking about my other pet subject, which Amanda has just mentioned, and whose name I will not mention. Some special guests here tonight. Extraordinary to have colleagues here who I've known a long time, who have donated. They've let me photograph work for the book. Sir Michael Llewellyn-Smith and his wife Colette, thank you so much. Thank you so much for everything. We've done a lot of work together in the past. Michael, who's a historian of the Macedonian campaign, which I've also published around that subject, and Colette and Michael and I, and my wife, went along and looked at the paintings you have of Gilbert's. They are in the book. And of course to Karen and Kathy, who were mentioned just previously, who we've made contact with. So delightful to have you here, Gilbert's granddaughters. Put your hands up again, because it is so wonderful to have you here. It's deeply moving to have colleagues, and part of writing the book was to make as much contact. The irony, of course, of doing a book is as soon as it's out, and it is out now, can't believe it, other things emerge. That's the nature of the beast, isn't it? There it is. There is one copy in the world, and that is it. The rest are in the depot, or the depot. It's rather chunky. 400 pages, 203 illustrations, 101,000 words, and everything else that you want in a book. And it's good for pressing flowers if you get bored at any point. So at the risk of moving quite quickly, and I do tend to talk fast, so do tell me to slow down or be a bit more measured, and do fire out if there are any questions. What I was going to do is is really a kind of a celebration of, have I done this right? Yeah, here we are. The excitement of searching the archives. For any historian, and I know Kathy's background is a historian as well, going into these places is just so exciting. It's the very stuff of research. And last week I laid out in front of all of my colleagues in the library at my university a chance to see the material that we have related to Gilbert Spencer. We have everything from his passport, medical certificate, a range of material. It is such a privilege to be on the inside of somebody else's life. You must never take it for granted, and you have to treat it with great respect and great honour. What I also was privileged to do, if I take a step back into the Holy Box territory, and just forgive me for 10 or so slides, just to show you the other archive that I was able to access maybe 5 or 6 years ago now. When I was working in Australia, I was able, through the National Trust, to visit the archive of the drawings, the templates, the sketches, the notes, the letters, the photographs of the origination of the chapel. So this is a Stanley Spencer story for a few slides, and then Gilbert and Stanley overlap, and then I'll go into the Gilbert story if you'll bear with me. So here we have the templates of the Holy Box, or the Godbox, as Stanley called it, drawn by a remarkable young architect called Lionel Pearson, who worked with Charles Holden. Pearson is an invisible figure in the architectural world, but he had to work very closely with our friend Stanley. And Stanley knew exactly what he wanted to the nth degree. He wanted an undecorated box, thick walls, with deep-set windows. He drew drawing after drawing after drawing, and poor old Lionel, the architect, tried to keep up with him. There were several people in this relationship, and it was not an easy relationship, largely because Stanley wanted something like that was based in Italy, and instead he was faced with a building that would have been right for the 1920s. The archive talks a great deal, and Amanda wrote a chapter for the book on the Berrand family, a remarkable family based in Berkeley, who did so much for young artists and young musicians in the 20s and the 30s. They were the most patient, generous, and thoughtful family possible. And without the chapel, poor old Hal, who was died of malaria as a result of malaria taken several times in the First World War, he would never have had the memorial that the chapel became. And what's interesting about the book, and what's interesting about the whole story, is you realize there are three people in this relationship. The artist, Stanley, you have the architect, and then you have the patrons. And it's a very uneven relationship, because Stanley was Stanley, very specific, very boisterous, very dogmatic, wanted exactly what he wanted, and the Berrands were there to do everything for the painter, and the poor old architect was stuck in the middle. And here's Stanley, as we know, in his military garb, photographed not far from here. It's always amazing to give talks in Cookham, within 100, 150 metres of where these photographs, where these events actually took place. And there's Stanley as a private in the Royal Army Medical Corps, there's Percy as a sergeant, and poor Sydney, who I just went up and look again and pay homage at the War Memorial there, and there is Sydney's name with his military cross after his name. And these are some of the work that Stanley did as a result. This is from the gallery, from the Stanley Spencer Gallery. These are mentioned in the book. The points where Gilbert and Stanley overlap is at this place here, not least as they were brought up clearly in Cookham as brothers, but also when they went off to the war, and they both worked at the Beaufort War Hospital in Bristol, a place I know very, very well. When I was Deputy Vice-Chancellor, I used to look after the faculty that was housed in this building here, and this was an extraordinary place to be as a young man. When Gilbert arrived, he called it that dreadful hospital, that vile tower, he wrote, and described it as menial labour in a uniform. I wrote in the book about it had a kind of whiff of a kind of carbolic grimness. I don't know where I got that phrase from, but it worked at the time. And really it was a very, very tough sort of induction into the world of adulthood for both brothers. A remarkable photograph here, and this is a quote again. Gilbert is such a good commentator on Stanley's practice. Gilbert was such a great observer, wrote an extraordinary book in 1961 about his brother, just as he was grieving for his brother and for the death of his own wife. And yet what he wrote about the time he was there with Stanley is really quite touching. And this quote here, Gilbert recalled his very first terrifying moments at the Beaufort when he was surrounded by a ward full of wounded Gallipoli soldiers. Here's a soldier here in his familiar bushwhacker hat there. Soldiers from Gallipoli, their skin sunburnt, their clothes bleached, and the soil, very soil of Gallipoli, Suvla Bay, where I have been, where Michael has been, and others. This is such a powerful evocation of the rawness of injury and the toughness of the environment they were in. Stanley Spencer Gallery has the complete collection of the letters that Stanley wrote to Desmond Chute, who was a godsend for him, based in Bristol, and helped him understand how to make of the war, of the menial labour, something that was much more miraculous. Stanley lost all of his drawings. Very few survived. In fact, hardly anything survived. More survived of Gilbert's. I'll show those in a second. And the other things in the book, and you may not get excited by shopping receipts. I don't normally, especially ones like from Sainsbury's I had yesterday. But what you see from the 1920s and the 30s as the building was being built, as the material was being gathered, we're talking about everything from extraordinary objects that we put together. I love this quote here as well. This is again Gilbert reflecting on the exactitude that Stanley brought to every task. I expect that Pearson found, as I did when Stan used to lecture me about the exactitude necessary when measuring up from the scale drawings, that the scale was very precise. Stan would order canvases to 3/16 of an inch. Can you imagine the craftsman having to work on those? No, quarter of an inch won't do, it's got to be 3/16. So we have in the book and in the archive, which is now locked away back in the National Trust, an entire record of what things cost. So Bill Head, who was builder, decorator and undertaker in Burgh Clear, the list of the expenditure on each part of the painting, that half of the west side walls, £250 that Stanley was painted, and then receipts for everything. And it's quite exciting, not least because you get materials, artist materials, the logs, the coal, the manure for the garden, everything is there. And for historians, for those interested in material culture, it brings the building to life. And that's what the book was essentially about. And I've given a whole lot of copies to the gallery to sell, because I think others ought to kind of experience it. This is Bill Head, a wonderful drawing done by Stanley. This is a record of his activity in the building, and the bill there for £7, 3 shillings. So lots of that material. When Stanley had a spare moment, incredible, in the middle of 6-7 years, up a scaffold, painting in that chapel that many of you will have seen. This is a wonderful drawing of Mercer, the wagoneer who used to pick the materials up from the railway station in the wagon and bring it into Burgh Clear, where it was used to build this remarkable building. And as Stanley said earlier, I was saying earlier on, I've decided the proportions of everything, the length of the building, the height of roof, the kind of roof, etc. As someone wrote, it's a compromise between design and faith. What Stanley wanted was very specific. What he got was something he wasn't quite happy with, but he was more excited that you opened the door and went inside. Pearson's idea for a built form was very different. Pearson wanted a very, very pitched roof, a very different kind of feel to it, with enclosed spaces for people to sit in, a different sort of almshouse. And Stanley, as always, knew his own mind, ruled them out. As Andy Daniels wrote, truly the architecture had become the handmaiden of painting. And other photographs that are in the book, never seen before. This is an astonishing image here. You can see the flash from the light has distorted the end wall, the resurrection of the soldiers. These are two of the workmen taking down some of the ladders. And then you have another photograph here of the building as it was even before the painting was put in place. And again, more photographs and paintings that Stanley did a little later on, which show the construction of the lunettes and the framework that was done for them. And there we are. There's the Proud Man, 1930. It was finished actually in 32, but by 1930 he said, having committed to staying in Burgh Clear forever, he said, had enough of Burgh Clear and going back to Cookham, and off he went. It does rank, I don't know if any of you know the 1,000 Best Churches, the book by Simon Jenkins. Some of you may dispute the 1,000 churches, but in the book it talks about this church and the interior of this church ranking alongside Owen, Sassoon, Benjamin Britten as one of the great icons of the First World War. And to finish on Stanley's story and move on to Gilbert, had the privilege in 2017, came back from Australia for the month, and there's me pontificating as I want to do. I think Amanda is in there. The other contributors are there: Sarah, who wrote the history of the garden; James, who wrote a beautiful chapter around the service set, and Carolyn wrote the most gorgeous entry to the book, and Unity and Sharon are there, and John and Gillian came along as well. So a moving moment to be surrounded by family and colleagues.